You know, they call these black swan developments in the market. Sometimes when you least expect it, something out of the blue comes. This Saudi Arabia situation right now and the fate of an American journalist, what happened to him and who was behind it. Out of the blue dictates where defense stocks are going for a while, where oil was going, bonds are going. They can be short-lived events or they can lead to bigger events. And certainly we saw that back in 1979 with the fall of the Shah of Iran. And, of course, the arrival of Ayatollah Khomeini. That was then. Could it be now? Let's go to former Carter Chief Domestic Policy Advisor, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat. By the way, he wrote, I think, the definitive book on the former president. Great book. President Carter of the White House here as he joins us right now. Ambassador, thanks for taking the time.
Neil, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
You know, without getting into the details of what's going on, mainly because I don't know them, you don't know them, Ambassador, I do wonder about just unexpected developments. And of course, what happened over the years, you were in the White House, not that you had anything to do with it, or for that matter, President Carter, but this idea that when you least expect it, something comes out of the blue, and invariably out of the Middle East. What do you make of it?
That's certainly true. In our case, as I mentioned in my book, it was the Iran oil crisis that sparked a doubling of oil prices and added to already high inflation. And President Carter took, I think, the right action, and I think one that President Trump should take. He's been, President Trump, highly personally, publicly critical of the Fed and its chairman, which I think is a mistake because it can undermine the confidence of the markets. But what President Carter said to us, Neil, going into a re-election campaign in 1979 is, I've tried everything. I inherited high inflation from Ford and Nixon, and it's gotten worse, in part because of Iran. And therefore, I'm going to appoint Paul Volcker to head the Fed, and I'm going to keep my hands off and let him do his job, even though Volcker was very clear, Neil, that he was going to tighten the money supply. It would cause an increase in interest rates, unemployment, and not once during the re-election campaign when Ronald Reagan was blasting those high interest rates and pointing at President Carter did he in turn blame Volcker. He let him do his job, and in fact inflation dropped like a rock, and we have it low today. Unfortunately, it didn't drop fast enough to help for our re-election.
In fact, sir, when I had him on, Jimmy Carter on a few weeks ago, he was conceding that, you know, obviously didn't help his re-election prospects, but I guess he and Volcker got to be good friends. They went fly fishing, I guess, together and all that.
Well, so, they did, and he kept hands off. He let Volcker do his job, and that's a lesson, I think, for President Trump. We have a very strong economy, and what I think Chairman Powell is doing is taking a page from the longest-standing Fed chairman, William McChesney Martin, who joked once that he was like the chaperone at a party. His job was to take away the punch bowl just when the party is warming up. So what the Fed is trying to do now, particularly because of these external events which could raise interest rates, is to take proactive steps now, small steps, but a signal to the market that he's not going to let inflation get out of control.
But wouldn't that be a killer, though, Ambassador, if it gets to be a problem, not over developments within the United States, but halfway around the world?
Quite the contrary. I think markets around the world depend on the Fed's independence. The Fed's raised interest rates.
I know that. I'm just saying that with the precipitant then, as you accurately pointed out, with Iran and everything else, and then gas and oil prices going crazy, and then the Federal Reserve having to interfere the way it did. Do you see something like that potentially happening now?
It's potential, but I don't think that will be the case. I think the global markets are strong. There is lower growth already in international markets. It would take an extraordinary circumstance to have anything like the doubling of oil prices in 12 months that we have. On the other hand, the Fed has to be cognizant of that possibility, and therefore, although they've signaled, Neil, that there'll be one more rate increase at the end of this year and 3 more in 2019, they've also said that they're going to look at external events to make sure that they're not overreacting. They want the Goldilocks notion, raise interest rates enough so that it dampens inflationary expectations, but not so much that it depresses growth. And they will be looking at these external events. They're not going to blindly go raising rates if some explosion occurs in markets, which I don't expect, but which could be possible.
You know, what's interesting, too, is we're in a different world than we were with the twin oil crises of the 70s, right? I mean, the ones that began under Richard Nixon continued years later under your administration with Jimmy Carter, because we had so much more independence energy-wise, right?
Neil, you're absolutely right. Over 50% of all of our oil use during the 1970s came from OPEC. And one of the reasons that President Carter got 3 energy bills passed deregulating the price of natural gas and crude oil to stimulate more domestic production, increase conservation measures, bringing solar on, was to reduce that dependence. And indeed, we have, as you properly point out, much less dependence today on OPEC oil than we did then. And that's a real plus for the United States.
Looking at the economy now, did you see any threat of like a hyperinflationary environment? A lot of people said that inflation will never be a problem again because we learned our lessons then. I always find, Ambassador, that history might not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. When we get so arrogant to think it can't happen again, it can. What do you think?
Well, anything can happen, but I think we learned a very harsh lesson during the 1970s. You know, Nixon got Arthur Burns, his chairman of the Fed then, to overstimulate interest rates. And our first Fed chairman, Bill Miller, also was too stimulative. Carter learned that lesson. That's why he appointed Volcker to tighten the money supply. And ever since, every Fed chairman, Greenspan, Bernanke, now Powell, Yellen, has recognized that the Fed cannot let inflation run away. Can something happen extraordinarily? Of course it can, but it's highly unlikely. And the reason is also that the markets expect the Fed to put the brakes on early enough to stamp out inflationary expectations. I don't see those expectations right now. Inflation is under good control, and the Fed wants to make sure that with the very strong economy that we have, in part because of the Trump tax cuts, that we don't end up with raising inflationary expectations with higher wages. So that's why they're taking these small steps. It's why President Trump should let them do so without trying to blast them publicly as being wild and going out of control. It's important that he allow the independence of the Fed, because if he doesn't, Neil, it sends a signal to the markets that the Fed is just going to be subject to political pressures, and that in turn will ironically raise inflationary expectations, the opposite of what President Trump should want.
Yeah, and it's any move the Fed makes, whether influence or not, is going to be seen through that prism, right?
Exactly. If they hold back, the markets will say, aha,
right,
they're reacting to political pressures, and that will raise expectations. So on the other hand, if they continue to raise them, barring, again, something unforeseen in world markets, as they have signaled they will do 3 times next year,
right,
once by the end of the year, then they risk further ire by the president. So they're in a very dicey situation. I think they will navigate it well. I don't see inflationary expectations going out of control if the president will let the Fed do its job.
I would not hold my breath on that. But Stuart, it's always good seeing you. Thank you very, very much.
Neil, thank you. It's always a pleasure.
All right.